The story I'm about to share with you today is considered one of the most disturbing true crimes of all time. And so there will be some disturbing footage shown at the end of the video which might be disturbing to some viewers. So viewers discretion advised. But before you get into the video, if you like this kind of spooky, scary style documentary video, please consider subscribing and also hit the like button so that anytime I upload a new video, you'll be the first person to see it. And so, without further ado, let's get straight into the video. So this story is about a very friendly old woman who owned a boarding house which she used to, rent out to people. But one day, a tenant came to her and then said, he wanted to visit his parents at, Mexico to, check up to see how they are doing. But after a couple of days of no one, hearing about this tenant who said he was going to visit his parents, the people who knew him immediately filed a missing person report. And so not long, the police launched an investigation to, determine the whereabouts of this tenant who said he was going to visit his parents. And so they came to the boarding house, searched around the house to, have a clue of where he was actually going or where he said he was actually going. And so after searching inside the house, they found nothing, nothing out of the ordinary. But after they decided to search around the house is where everything started. What they discovered in the boarding house backyard, was so gruesome and so abrupt that everybody asked, how in the world didn't we see this coming? In February 1988, a young outreach counselor with the Volunteers of America named Judy Moyes met this, gentle bearded man called Alvaro Montoya. Now, Montoya was developmentally ill and had schizophrenia, which is like a condition that had left him on the streets years before he met Moyes. And so after Montoya, reached out to the Volunteers of America, which is this non-profit organization, he was accepted, and a couple of months later, Moyes was assigned to be the social worker. After a few days of meeting Montoya, Moyes felt very strongly to help this man who was in a very bad condition, considering his mental illness. And so seeing Montoya homeless, he thought it would make sense to find a place for him to stay and also to recover. After a few conversations with his organization, she found the perfect place for him to stay, and this was a boarding house located at Sacramento, California. Luckily, the house was owned by this sweet charitable woman named Dorothy Puente. Now, Puente seemed very passionate about charity work and also help take care of people who were kind of abandoned by their family, like the homeless, the elderly, and also the disabled. And so overall, everybody liked Puente. And so when Moyes heard about this woman, he didn't hesitate. He said, great, then I'm just going to get a place for Montoya to stay. And yes, Moyes did just that. He went and then talked to Puente and secured a place for Montoya to stay. And truly, when you go to the boarding house, Puente was very kind, and he was willing to accept Montoya to come and stay in the boarding house. Moyes became happy that finally he had been able to help someone who was living on the street just a couple of months ago and also disabled. And also Montoya, even though he was mentally disabled and wasn't that well, he was very happy that finally someone has been able to get a place for him to stay and also recover. So everybody was happy. And so not long ago, Moyes took Montoya to stay with Puente. And yes, Puente received him very well. And then overall everything was good. After Moyes sent Montoya to the boarding house, she left, and she didn't really communicate regularly with Montoya, but he had the regular meetings where Montoya would come to her place to have a meeting with her because she was a social worker. Montoya liked the house, except one time that he complained that he wanted to leave the house, but he didn't really give a tangible reason why he wanted to leave the house. And so Moyes kind of advised him a little bit, and everything was off. He just kind of write it off, and then Montoya decided to continue to stay in the house. But after that complaint, there was no other complaint from Montoya to leave the house, and Montoya seemed to like the house very, very well. But in October 1988, which was about 8 months after Montoya had lived in the boarding house, Montoya went to Puente when Puente was cooking some tamales, and said, I haven't been able to visit my parents for a couple of months now, and I've really missed them, and I want to go and pay them a visit. And Montoya would say, great, family is family, and family will always be family, and so you gotta go visit them. And Montoya would say, yeah, I gotta go visit them. Puente asked where Montoya family lived, and Montoya said they lived at Mexico. And Puente said, great, as soon as you get there, please give me a call so that I'll be able to know that you are there. And Montoya would say, okay, as soon as I get there, I'll give you a call. And so Puente saw Montoya leave the house. After a few days, Moise, the social worker who had brought Montoya to the boarding house, passed by to say hi and kind of check how Montoya was doing, and also asked him why he didn't show up to a meeting, because she was supposed to have a meeting with Montoya, and Montoya didn't show up. And so overall she was just passing by to say hi to Montoya. But upon getting into the boarding house, she noticed that Montoya no longer lived there, which was a bit strange. And so in his mind he was like, where is Montoya? I brought him a couple of months into this boarding house, and where is he? And so she went straight to ask Puente, the boarding house owner. And then Puente would say, Montoya came to tell me he wanted to visit his parents at Mexico, and so he left to Mexico to visit his parents. But as Puente was saying that, she kind of paused and said, actually Montoya returned but moved to Utah. And so Moine said, okay, when he returns back, tell him that I was here, and also remind him that he had a meeting with me and he didn't show up, and so tell him that I was here. And so Puente said, okay, as soon as he returned, I'll let him know. Moines took it lightly because Montoya himself was kind of a transient, meaning like he didn't stay at one place, he liked moving around, and so he didn't really think of it too much. But after a couple of days of not hearing from Montoya, she kind of thought about it and was like, Montoya had told her that his family kind of abandoned him, and now Puente is also saying he's going to visit his family. And so looking at the inconsistency in Puente's statement kind of made her a bit suspicious. And after a couple of days of not hearing from Montoya, he went straight to the police station and filed a missing person report. Officer Cabrera was the lead investigator of the Montoya's case, and the file landed on his table within a day of the filings. The following morning, Cabrera made a visit to the boarding house to investigate and to see if he could have a clue of the whereabouts of Montoya. As he got to the boarding house, he saw Puente, the boarding house owner, the old lady, and had a little conversation with her, to which he said Montoya had gone to Mexico to visit his parents but returned back and then went to Utah. After Cabrera had a conversation with Puente, he went on to speak to another tenant in the house named John Sharp. Now John Sharp also said the same thing that Puente said, he went to Mexico and then he returned and then he went to Utah, and he said, yeah, actually what Puente was saying was true. He went to Mexico and then blah 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 blah. And so at that point the officer had kind of gotten to a dead end of the case and didn't really know where to search or where to have a clue of the whereabouts of Montoya. But as he was about to leave, John Sharp, which is the tenant he talked to him previously, kind of slipped a little note in his hands that read, "She's making me lie." And so at that point, Cabrera became kind of confused because he didn't know who was really telling the truth, whether it was Puente or John Sharp. Cabrera with his team decided to do a little search in the house, in the boarding house, to see whether they can have any clue of the whereabouts of Montoya. And so yes, they did just that. They searched the house a little bit and then went through the things of Montoya, but they didn't find anything out of the ordinary. So they decided to go out and search around the house a bit to just out of curiosity to see if they can find anything that could lead them to where Montoya had gone, because right now they didn't really know where he said he was going, and they couldn't really rely on what Puente was saying, because John Sharp was also saying something else. And so they went out of the house and then did a little search around the house. They didn't find anything, and they went to the backyard of the house to search a little bit. But as they were walking around the backyard of the house, Cabral noticed that a soil had been recently disturbed, like there had been some digging there not long ago. And so out of curiosity, they decided to search the place where the soil had been disturbed. And so shovel by shovel they started digging, but after a couple of digging, they didn't find anything out of the ordinary. But it was when they started digging the second hole that everything started to unfold. As they started digging the second hole, Jim Wilson, a federal probation officer who was part of the officers, digging, thought he heard a muted sound as a shovel, struck something beneath the earth. And so he called Cabrera and the other officers to, come and help him, scoop out some soil from that spot where he was digging. And after helping him do that, they saw something that, resembled a tree root. But when they attempted to, extract it from the soil, they couldn't. They tried with their shovel, but still they couldn't. And so Cabrera, the officer who was the lead investigator, jumped into the hole and then tried to extract it with his shovel, but still he couldn't. And so he grabbed hold of the object with his hand, and then with a little bit of force, he managed to, pull it out, and he was immediately shocked. It turns out that the object in the soil wasn't a tree root, but rather a human leg bone. And immediately everybody was shocked. The officers just stopped by to do a regular check to see if they could find the whereabouts of Montoya, and now a human bone was in their hand. Cabrera quickly jumped out of the hole, and then everybody was shocked. Everybody was just terrified. After close examination of the human remains they dug from the soil, it was later determined that this person was actually 78-year-old Leonardo Carpenter. Now, Carpenter was actually released into Puente's care in 1987 after she was discharged from a hospital. But after staying with Puente and suffering and not making any improvement on his sickness, she later disappeared and no one saw him again. And so immediately Puente became the suspect. But after she was brought to the police station and questioned a little bit, she denied all the accusations against her. And so they let her go. But the officers didn't stop there. The next morning, they actually came back to the house and then continued digging. And at this point, Montoya was still not found. And so they just came back the next morning to, continue digging the yard and to see if they could find any, further evidence. Puente asked the police after they have converged on the property to, go and meet his nephew for some coffee, and claimed his nerves were getting the best of her. And so the police said, okay, alright, you can go and meet, your nephew. But shortly after letting her go, they discovered another body. And it was too late to, arrest her because she was far gone. And no one really knew her whereabouts. So immediately, they issued an arrest warrant against Puente. And she was actually found 4 days later at a motel in California and was immediately arrested. In total, 7 bodies were discovered in the boarding house's backyard, including Montoya's, and this is how police presume all the killings, went. Ruth Monroe, a 61-year-old woman, had a husband who had, fallen terminally ill, and so Monroe moved in with his best friend Dorothy Puente for, support. But things didn't go as planned. After just, 3 weeks of moving into Puente's boarding house, her situation just became worse, and Monroe was reported dead on April 28, 1982. But after doctors performed an autopsy on Monroe's body, it was determined that she actually died on overdosing of, codeine and other drugs which was not, prescribed to her. When Puente was questioned at the time about Monroe's death, he told police that, his friend had committed suicide because he was, depressed about his husband's terminal illness. And since the police didn't really have a strong evidence that connected Puente to Monroe's death, they ruled it as a suicide, and they didn't file any charges against her. But the family of Monroe just didn't believe that. They believed that Puente had dragged Monroe possibly by slipping medication into an alcohol. The second victim of Puente, presumed by police, was a man named Everson Gilmouth. In July 1982, Puente was sentenced to 5 years in prison for grand theft. During her time in jail, she became pen pal with Gilmouth, who was 77 years old at the time. And after she was released from prison on September 9, 1985, which was about serving half of his prison sentence, Gilmouth moved from Oregon to California to join Puente because, the two of them, felt deeply in love with each other. And they ultimately decided to get married. However, no one really saw the marriage. Within that year, which was the year they decided to, get married, Puente hired a handyman to, build a wooden box for her and gave him a size of 6 feet by 30 inches by 6 feet. But before the box could be complete, Puente asked the handyman to help her dispose of the box, which at this time weighed approximately 300 pounds. So after helping her dispose of the box near a river about an hour away from Sacramento, it was later discovered on January 1st, 1986 that the box Puente disposed of contained a body, but the body wasn't identified until December 28, 1986, which was about 3 years later because the body, was so decomposed. And shockingly, the body was Everson Gilmouth's body, Puente's ex-husband. Gilmouth's body was so decomposed that no official cause was actually declared, but police believe that he was, killed by Puente's typical process, which is dragging. 65-year-old Dorothy Miller was another boarder who lived in Puente's boarding house when he vanished on, October 1989. Like the other victims of Puente, Miller died at the hands of a drug overdose. Though her body was, badly decomposed after he was, dug from Puente's boarding house backyard, traces of lorazepam was found in her remains. But what makes his death so gruesome and so shocking is that when her body was discovered, Miller's arm was found duct taped to her chest. This means that after Puente murdered her, he actually chopped off his hands and then duct taped it to his chest to, help him bury her simply. And after killing her, Puente continued to forge Miller's check, totaling over $11,000 after she was no longer staying in the boarding house. On March 9, 1988, Benjamin Fink was sent to live with Puente in her boarding house. Fink's brother paid him a weekly visit to the boarding house for about 6 weeks. But on April, just like the other victims, he also, disappeared. Before his disappearance, Puente told, the other boarders in the boarding house that he was sending Finks to upstairs to, make him feel better, because she said things didn't like downstairs. But after a few weeks, a tenant reported, smelling a foul smell emanating from upstairs where Fink's bedroom was, but was told by Puente that, it was just a sewer problem. On April 29th, Puente received 12 bags of cement, and on June, she had a hole dug next to a door of a metal shed, which was later filled with, concrete. Fink's body would later be unearthed from the same place and was, dressed only in a pair of boxers. Like Miller and also the other victims, the body contained traces of lorazepam. Now, if you remember, Leonardo Carpenter's body was the first body which was dug from Puente's backyard. Another gruesome discovery that was made by detective was the body of, Betty Palmer. Now, Palmer was a 77-year-old woman who mysteriously went missing under Puente's care. On August 1986, Palmer went to a doctor's appointment but was never seen again. But what is so terrible about Palmer's body discovery is that the body was, found missing with the head, hands, and the feet in Puente's backyard. While Palmer went missing, Puente was discovered to have an ID bearing Palmer's name but Puente's picture. She used it in order to, collect Palmer's benefits. Now, there are other, gruesome discovery that was made by detectives in the boarding house, which I'm not really going to go over it because there are so many. But ultimately, Alvaro Montoya's body was found underneath a freshly planted apricot tree in Puente's side yard, which was adjacent to Carpenter's. It was later revealed after toxicology testing that he was drugged just like the others, and his body contained traces of carbamazepine. It is believed that Montoya was the last victim of Dorothea Puente, but she might have murdered more victims, which their bodies were never discovered. After Dorothea Puente was arrested, she was charged with 9 counts of murder for the 7 bodies found in her backyard, including Montoya's body. She was ultimately convicted of 3, because the jury could not agree on the other 6. Puente was ultimately sentenced to life in prison, but never pleaded guilty nor confessed to any of the crimes before dying in 2011 of natural causes. Okay, so that would be it, guys. If you found something in today's video, please consider hitting the subscribe button, and also hit the like button if you like the video, because I'll be uploading every week. And so, until then, see you in the next one.